I finally finished my first week in medical school, and needless to say, it was a lot. If you're new to my channel, my name is Sally, and I'm a first-year medical student. So what happened in medical school? This week, a lot happened. A lot of educational material, and unfortunately I can't share that with you, but I can tell you a little bit about everything that happened this week. Our first ever class in medical school was genetics, and it wasn't bad at first, but there definitely was a lot of material. As we progressed through the week, the material got more and more intense. On Monday, we were introduced to anatomy lab, and our professor underscored the importance of the humanity behind the donor bodies that we had the privilege of learning from. Specifically, it was exceptionally special to read the letters that family members wrote on behalf of the donor bodies. These donor bodies were people. They loved to cook, they loved to bake, they had beautiful singing voices and an insane sense of humor. And it was so emotional, learning about their story, learning about why they wanted to contribute to the field of medicine and to the education of students. These people had children and grandchildren, and it was truly humbling to be reminded of the selflessness of these individuals and their contributions to medical education. On Tuesday, we had more genetics, and I was able to practice taking vitals on a fellow classmate. It was definitely awkward, and little things like watching someone while they breathe to take their respiratory rate was so embarrassing, but it was kind of fun, and honestly, it's important practice, especially since it's a good introduction to the beginnings of doctoring. Wednesday was even more genetics, and Thursday, we finally donned our little scrubs and headed to anatomy lab. I had never taken anatomy lab before, so it was a bit overwhelming, a lot of information to take in, but it was actually quite fun to learn about the different veins and arteries coursing through our bodies. Friday, we talked about ethics, and I think now is a great time to tell you about what I learned this week. This segment is Fast Facts with Sally. Trigger warning. I will be discussing genetic conditions and some graphic symptoms associated with these genetic disorders, so if this is something that you're not comfortable with, I would suggest clicking off. So with all of the genetics I learned, we had genetics 4 out of the 5 days of the week. We obviously learned about genetic disorders and genetic conditions. Where to begin? Bombay Blood. There's actually a rare condition where a specified group of people cannot receive regular ABO blood. They have to receive something called Bombay Blood. This was first discovered in Bombay, India, currently known as Mumbai, India. And these individuals have a genetic mutation that makes them lack a protein important to ABO blood. Consequently, their immune system will attack ABO blood because they think it's a foreign object. People with Bombay blood can only receive transfusions from other individuals with Bombay blood. Achondroplasia. You've probably already heard of this condition, especially if you've watched Little Women.
No.
No. Not that Little Woman. Little Women Atlanta, respectfully.
Hey. How y'all doing?
Achondroplasia is the most common type of short-limbed dwarfism. It's caused by a mutation in a growth factor receptor. This affects skeletal development. People with achondroplasia can have shorter limbs, larger head size, and poor muscle tone. And someone you might recognize with achondroplasia is Peter Dinklage, who played Tyrion Lannister in Game of Thrones. Holoprocencephaly. So holoprocencephaly is one of the more graphic conditions. It is a condition that occurs within the first few weeks of pregnancy. And this condition is characterized by the failure of the forebrain, or the front of the brain, to develop normally into two hemispheres, the right and the left. The severity of this condition varies based on how much the forebrain is developed, but symptoms can range from developmental delays and facial clefting to something as rare and severe as cyclopia, which, as the name suggests, is the formation of one eye cavity as opposed to two. Children with cyclopia are either stillborn or usually pass away within hours after birth. Another genetic condition that you've probably heard of is Down syndrome. Down syndrome is also known as trisomy 21, and it is defined by an extra chromosome 21. The extra chromosome is often caused by an error in cell division. Symptoms of Down syndrome can include developmental delays and intellectual delays, but individuals with Down syndrome can live very full and fulfilling lives. We actually had a patient presentation on Down syndrome. Parents and patients came to talk about their experiences with Down syndrome and what it was like raising a child with Down syndrome. One parent told me that having a daughter with Down syndrome was like having a child but for longer. And patients with Down syndrome are usually very trusting and very wonderful to be around. Prader-Willi syndrome. Prader-Willi syndrome is a genetic condition that is caused by a lack of a paternal gene expression on chromosome 15. People with Prader-Willi syndrome often have difficulty feeding and eating as newborns, but as they grow, they develop hyperphagia, which is overeating, and obesity. In fact, these individuals never feel full, so they can sometimes eat until their stomach bursts. This, combined with behavioral issues, means that patients with Prader-Willi syndrome will do anything for food, and this can include digging through trash, breaking into neighbors' homes, and stealing. This causes caretakers to lock fridges and pantries because these patients have such complicated ties to food. We had the privilege of speaking with someone with Prader-Willi syndrome, and she was relatively independent. She was working, she had a boyfriend, and she was an avid equestrian. So having someone talk about their experiences with Prader-Willi syndrome was very interesting. So with all of these genetic conditions, we have to talk about genetic testing. We have some diagnostic and screening tools to help pregnant women learn more about the genetic predisposition of their child. So some diagnostic tools include amniocentesis, and this is something you've probably heard of. This is when you draw amniotic fluid to test for conditions like Down syndrome. We also have something called cordocentesis, which gets samples from the umbilical cord, and this can help identify Down syndrome as well, or possible blood disorders. Finally, we have chronic villus sampling, which samples the placenta. And so this can test for chromosomal and metabolic disorders. We have screening tools, which are different from diagnostic tools because screening tools are less invasive and they give a preliminary idea of what's going on. Screening tools can include ultrasounds to look for physical attributes that may suggest a genetic condition. For example, you can use an ultrasound to determine whether a baby has a recessed nose bridge or the lack of a nose bridge, or a thick fold in the back of their neck, and that could suggest Down syndrome. There's also something called non-invasive parental screening, known as NIPS, and that detects fetal DNA in the mother's blood to help determine whether or not the baby has some sort of genetic condition. NIPS is less invasive than some of the diagnostic tools, but it doesn't give you as definitive of an answer. Given all of these genetic tests, a big ethical question arises. Is it ethical for expecting mothers to terminate a pregnancy if their child has a detected genetic condition? Is it discriminatory to those living with genetic conditions? And does it suggest to them that their lives are not worth living? Or is genetic testing necessary to prepare parents for all outcomes, including biological or even financial outcomes, because some parents can't afford to take care of a child with a genetic condition. Thanks for watching today's video, and I hope it was somewhat insightful. Apologies for the lack of footage, but I do hope that you learned something today. I know I definitely learned a lot this week. With that said, see you next time.